I do have a fantastic two individuals. I think no need introduction of these two individuals. But then again, it's my honor and responsibility to introduce these two individuals. Number one, she's an internationally best-selling author of Softening the Edge, the founder of the world's first organization empathy platform, Empathy Elsewhere, Everywhere. And the top 5 rated podcast host, again, a fellow podcaster. It's nice to have those people with me as well. So he's an experienced organization consultant and a CEO of Global and Agency Freedom. She's a well-known keynote speaker, contributor, advocate for the global movement for balance, humanization, and capitalism in our workplace, focusing on the future of leadership. One thing I really love this particular part is she always works on the inclusive millennial leader. And it's really going to touch the topic we are going to have. It's going to be really spicy and sweet today, the conversation, right? So let me introduce this gentleman. I think no need introduction. He has always been an explorer, a dreamer, an adventurer, right? He is rarely content. He is rarely content with. He has accomplished and thrives seeking out challenge. His experience in the industry span more than 2 decades. And he's the founder and the destiny architect of Hi-Fi Consultancy and Luminary Learning Solution. A leader, thought leader, and an author and a TEDx speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mimi Nicklin and Vidusha Nathavithara. The context I'm just the topic we are going to talk about is leadership redefined. I think leadership, in a sense, we are not going to, the conversation for sure, it's going to be various aspects of it. Because when you say leadership, we always think in a corporate context. There will be different element and aspect will be coming into the picture. But it's a different angle we are going to look at. The look at is, how do you guide multi-generational workforce is something we're going to talk about. And it is hot topic these days because maybe Vidusha, every time we walk in for a session and, midway, this is the only question comes, okay, we have baby boomers, we have generation Y, X, Z, and we have millennials and alpha on the process. No, we have a problem, How do you really mingle them? So that's the conversation is about. So Mimi, Vidusha, thank you very much for accepting this invitation and coming on stage and being part of the 100th episode. Let me start off this context. Yes, we do have some sort of a generational labeling going on these days in the corporate context. But what my thought process is, as leadership styles, in what ways and how we can adapt to cater diverse range of employees in the workplace, right? Because we do have different generation. Now, this has been a struggle, what we are trying to, all the corporate leaders going to focus on, right? So the question is, do we need to really change our leadership style to engage with workforce? So I'm going to open, Mimi.
I was about to throw her under the bus first because it's so much easier when someone starts and you can actually just add into it. Okay, just to set context to this, right? I think the trouble we are finding is that you find your children at work, right? My daughter is 21, and every time I walk into the workspace, I'm thinking, that looks like one of the kids I can have, right? So one of the biggest challenges is that you have 2 roles to play. The first is, of course, you have a personal life and then you have a professional life. It's very difficult to switch off between the two. So when you walk into work and you have a young person out there, the first instinct that comes in is, this is one of my kids. And I've been on the other end of the spectrum where people have called me puta, at work. And that's probably the most condescending possible thing that you can go through when somebody calls you puta. Because any respect you have as a profession is gone. I still remember the first training program I turned up, made a fundamental mistake of, walking into John Keel's for the first time and running a training program there. I asked the general questions, who's coming, who are the people who are turning up. They gave me a list of names, they gave me their designations. All of them were executives, 1 or 2 assistant managers. And in my books, an executive is 21, 22, 25 years old at most. You don't expect a 45-year-old to turn up as an executive. Most of them were 45 plus, and I was 38. And one of them raised their hands and turned around and said, Puta, and that was the end of the training program, because any respect you have as a trainer at that point who's supposed to give you advice is gone when somebody calls you Puta. So that's a challenge for sure, because whoever that is older than you and group of people who are younger than you, whatever you label them, there is going to be a conflict, and you don't need to go too far, you just need to go home for that conflict to play out. So if you have kids, well, imagine your kids being at work and what that will be like, and you'll figure it out. But answering your question, I think the question is not so much about leadership style per se, because I think fundamentally, I think leadership is leadership. Irrespective of whether it is at home or whether it is at work, it's fundamentally just two things, right? Leadership boils down to just two things. Number one, making sure that people deliver a result. I think that's at the heart of leadership. And the second is, how do people feel afterwards? That's it, right? So I think the difference between management and leadership is management often is at the cost of people, and leadership is through people, right? That's the only difference. Again, go back to home. You can scare the living daylights out of your kids and get them to study. Or you can inspire them to study. You still get good grades. Or if your kid is not so smart, no matter how much of inspiration you get, they might not necessarily get good grades. But how do you feel afterwards? Do you feel really awful about the fact that you got really bad grades? Or do you feel good about the fact that you at least made 5 more marks than what you did before? Right? It's the same mark that you got. It's how you look at it. So, answering your question in just 3 points. Number one, I don't think leadership changes much. I'll get into the context of it after that. Much. So it's about making sure the results come, and it's about making sure that people feel, not good about themselves is the wrong way to use it, but at least inspired in a little way by doing it. Number two, I think the irrespective of who comes, leadership is about tweaking your approach to the person involved. It's a bit like having 2 kids. Right? If you have 2 kids like I do, the first, I think, is clearly not mine. I often ask my wife, are you sure this is my kid? Because she wakes up in the morning every day and wants to go to school. Right? I swear to you, if she didn't look like my mother, I would have gone and done a paternity test at that point. Not to wager bad things about my wife in any way. Because I don't think I can ever have a child who wants to go to school. My son, on the other hand, is my son. He will dodge school at any point in time. So the way you approach your daughter when it comes to getting something done, and the way you approach your son would be fundamentally different, even though both of them are your children. The same goes to your team. Right? So I don't think you can turn around and say, okay, this is the way you lead, because it needs to be contextualized, it needs to be personalized. The third, I think, and this is where we miss things, is I do think, given the fact that we have multiple generations right now, the people who are coming in now have a lot more opportunity. And they have parents like you who will easily turn around and tell them, Puta, වැඩිය ගණන් ගන්න එපා, ඔයාට මේක අමාරු නම් ගෙදර ඉන්න. Whereas our parents would have probably kicked us behind and told us to go to work, even if we wanted to quit. Right? So when you have a ton of opportunity, and parents who would probably look after you if you didn't have a job, I'm not saying this is true for everybody. Obviously, contexts are very, very different in different tiers in society. But most of the people who come and work for you are your own children, right, at some point. That context changes. So the way you would inspire someone who is just 18 or 19 or 20 years old and who comes from parents like you, and the way you would have to inspire me at my generation with my little fears of losing my job even now would be fundamentally different. Right? So as long as you understand those 3 principles, I think you're fine.
Maybe your thought?
Yeah, I mean, I would build on them. I think we're at a point now, and you touched on this just now, that for the first time in history, we have 4 generations in the workplace.
Absolutely.
And that's never happened in history. So you might have the chairperson, which tends to be a man, but chairman, chairwoman at the top, potentially in their 70s, sometimes even 80s. And then all the way at the bottom, as you were just saying, you might have someone who's 17 or 18. Now, of course, a 70-year-old and a 17-year-old have very little in common when it comes to how they approach their day-to-day life, right? So I spend a lot of time telling people that as human beings, what makes us human is fundamentally the same. We all want to belong, we all want to be accepted, we all want to be loved, we all want to grow. But how we communicate, how we see value, how we find confidence and plan for the future has changed significantly. So when I work with my clients, often those older leaders, and by older I mean anyone over 45. This is not old people, right? This is older people than the 17-year-olds, right? But anyone in that generation will say to me, and in fact I had a session yesterday where they said the same thing, but Mimi, how do I get them to find their ambition? And I say, well, have you asked them? No. Well, perhaps that's where you should start, right? Because how they see the world and what they want and what we wanted, and then the generation above us is incredibly different, like how we perceive that value. So I think the reason we have to, and you and I slightly disagree on this, have to shift our leadership style, in my opinion, is because the world has changed, right? The way we're working, those workforces that we're facing, have so many varied degrees. And I agree with you that it's like looking at children, right? When you have different children in an environment, they need different things. So does the workforce. But I think the second thing I would say to add to that is that the overall context that we're working within has also shifted significantly. And I believe, I feel I know, in fact, that we are living in fear, right? And that fear, and you're a coach, right? We're not always conscious of it. A lot of that is subconscious fear. But ever since COVID, but probably before, we live in such a tumultuous world. And every time we open Instagram, you cannot help but be bombarded by disaster after disaster after disaster, whether it's political or economical or social. And there are children in the room, so I won't talk too much about it. But the reality is that there is context to that, and we carry it. And when people live in a constant state of fear, whether that is conscious or unconscious, they need different things from their leaders, right? Because they're coming into work. I mean, you think of us in Sri Lanka, I've lived here the last 3 years. Going to work last year was significantly different to this year. And hopefully next year it will be, smoother and easier in every year that comes. That demands of us to have different things from our leadership. So it's a very tumultuous world. And on top of that, as you said, we have this multi-generational workforce who all see those challenges differently.
So let me put in the other context out of it. And we talked about leadership. What about the people who are coming, the younger generation's perspective? Because their expectation has been totally different than me and you going to work, right? Of course, technology has been part of it because we didn't have the technology. We just go and look out for what's the organization look like, what's the culture. But now, people who comes in, I think there are a lot of C-level people here. They do ask, they decide which company they go to. Even you and me like to hire him, you can't hire, right? Now, in that context, how do you really manage those expectations at the leadership level?
You mean manage the expectation
of the people
of the new team? Yeah, I mean, it's definitely significantly shifted. When you look at the data today around the top 5 reasons to either take or stay in a job, that has moved hugely. So money is normally between 3 and 5 in that position, often 4 and 5. So the top reasons that youth are going to, choosing, and staying in organizations sit with value alignment, number 1, and I'm not saying these in order because it changes by country, but fundamentally, value alignment. So I'm working in a business that sees the world similarly to me, that I believe behaves in a way that is aligned to who I am, would be number 1. Empathy and being understood is the second one. So the data shows, and this is big data, this is 6,000 people globally, all around the world, that 79% of people will leave their job, their experience, and their industry to find a boss that listens to them, right? And I believe that's what's behind the Great Resignation. People just saying, do you know what, I'm done. If you don't want to hear me and see me for who I am, whether you are in admin or leadership, I will go and find an environment where I do feel seen, because we're pro-social humans. That's what we need to survive. So fundamentally, it's around value alignment, being seen and heard, and then growth. Needing to grow, and you both work in coaching and development space. As human beings, to grow is to move. That is what is to be alive, right? I do not want to stagnate, and that is, again, across all levels. So I think the first thing that organizations and leaders have to do is work out, what are those 3 things? How do I allow my people to grow? How do I align to their values and the values of the people around me whilst staying true to the business we are? And then how do we hear and see our people more? But Fidusha, That's my thoughts on the matter.
No, and I completely agree, right? And even in the previous one, I don't think there's a misalignment because ultimately it's not particularly your style, okay? It's being able to understand your context and shift to it. I think that's fundamental to leadership, irrespective of whether you're in the army or whether you're in the corporate world or whether you're with kids. That's fundamental. If you can't shift and if you rigidly turn around and say, okay, this is who I am and you need to align with that, that only worked with slaves. You can do that with slaves because they have to do what you ask them to do, right? I do kind of resort to that with my 12-year-old. Why do I have to do this? Because I tell you to. Very simple. But that only works until you're about 14 years old. But here's, just to build up on what you just said, right? Here are two things that I think have been there for all time, but I don't think has been pronounced as it is now. I think from the time Herzberg did the two-factor theory, we have identified things as hygiene factors and as motivators, right? The only difference is whether it was hygiene factors or motivators, our generation didn't have an option. My father's generation had much less also. So if we join an organization, whether we like the organization or not is irrelevant. The question is, can we stay there and make sure that we make a living? Because if you moved, the great unknown was unbearable because there were very few jobs to go around. Today, I was just sharing just outside, right? There was a LinkedIn profile and he kind of said hi and I said hi. He said, I do videos, and I said, you know what, I'm actually looking for someone to do videos. And then it turns out he's 14 years old. And now I have a moral dilemma. Do I actually give him a job or, you know, do I tell him, can you please talk to your parents? Because I really don't want the kid telling the parents, and the parents kind Sri Lanka is a pretty small place. You can kind of get beaten up quite badly for these kind of things. So I wrote to him and said, can you please ask your father and mother for permission to do this, right? You're 14 years old. And he got offended. And he wrote this big story saying, if I was in the US, you would probably encourage me as an entrepreneur. This is the whole problem with Sri Lanka. And now I'm thinking, what do you want me to do, right? You never had that problem when we were growing up. School was the only thing we did, right? Sneaking out of school probably was more apt, but at least you go to school nominally. But the point I want to make is that what has shifted is the fact that that truth no longer holds true. So the expression of yourself comes out way more. Now I think also, remind yourself that they're 18 or 19 years old now. Wait until they're 30, they'll probably turn out to be just like us. Give them 2 kids, give them a housing loan, give them their lease, and they'll probably start thinking like us because they have responsibility at that point in time. But even if you wanted to have self-expression, I don't think we ever had that choice. They do. And in a society where choice is a given, you take it. When options are given, you take it, right? If you don't have an option, you go with the flow. It's that simple, right? So what needs to shift is this. I think we've always known that there are things that would necessarily have to be there fundamentally, like your salary, like a decent desk to sit on, a computer that works. Good Lord, get those right first, because we talk about all the other stuff and the poor soul doesn't have a computer to work on, and it starts crashing, and it's the most frustrating thing that you can do, right? And most organizations get that wrong. They don't have a desk to sit on sometimes when they turn up, right? Or they haven't got their appointment letter on time. But none of those are going to keep you with the organization, because that's not enough. So the motivational factors, like you spoke about, like the growth, like the boss that actually cares for you and your growth, and all of that needs to be built up on top of that. I don't think that also has shifted. But today, if you don't do it, the difference is we would have taken 10 years to leave. They'll probably take 6 months or less.
10 minutes.
Yeah.
I think with this, just to add on, right? I think all the industry, I think the HR practitioners will know that, like, hiring and firing happening like now, soon or nothing like that.
There's only hiring. There's no firing. We don't have people to fire. We will keep even the worst guy possible. You know, there was something like 2 million people who left. Anyone who, I actually tell people, please stay in Sri Lanka. This is the best time to stay in Sri Lanka because all the good guys have left. This is our opportunity.
It is.
You know, because you can be absolutely average, but you'll still be regarded as brilliant because there's no one left. I swear, the best talent always leaves, right? So the challenge is that. So I don't think the firing ever it gets to firing.
Not applicable.
Firing is not applicable. Even if they do something horrendously wrong, we'll say, we'll sort you out. Because we don't have enough people. Ask them, they will, there's vacancies,
So,
yeah,
that's an interesting perspective because especially the Gen Zs, there was a report came by 6 Seconds in October. Gen Zs has been the most stressed out, burnout generation in the workforce. Is there any connection between choosing this place and shifting places, leaders? What do you think, Mimi? Burnout.
Gen Z are the highest burnout. I think probably they're, not that I'm debating the data, but I think probably they're not. I think they just do something about it, right? I think that as human beings, there is just huge amounts of burnout. So we have a mental health crisis, right? We have 400 million people with depression and anxiety. On top of that, 52% of the world, so half of the room, statistically, are lonely. So we have a loneliness endemic. And the Surgeon General in the US in July came out and said that the loneliness endemic is now the highest burden to our healthcare costs worldwide. And it is as dangerous, get this, as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. A day, right? So loneliness, I don't know why you're laughing. I'm not judging your cigarettes or your loneliness. No judgment. I'm an empathy specialist. We don't judge. So it's dangerous, right? It's dangerous to our health. And on top of that, we have some serious issues with areas such as suicide in our youth, right? In our youth. So you were talking earlier, Vidusha, about choice. I think that with the younger generations, there is obviously a perception of more choice, but they also have a megaphone to share that information out there. So I don't know the data behind that data as to why they were saying the young people have high levels of burnout, but I do know that working with these organizations, that they're far more likely to communicate that, and to be honest, good on them. Right, good on them, because we have to talk about these things, right?
And also do something about it.
Do something about it. Don't just live through it, right? Because again, when I say older, ladies and gentlemen, I really do just mean 35, 45. We're not talking old, but the older generations, they express that they enter burnout as a surprise. And maybe someone in the room has experienced this. One day you're fine, and the next day you're like, holy Maloney, I'm not, right? So you always see on LinkedIn, leaders, senior leaders, posting, sorry I've been quiet for a while, but this is what happened. One day they were leading and they were doing fine with their 2,000 people, and the next day they were like, I need 3 months off right now. So at least the young people are they are educated, and that's up to us, we have been educating them, to understand what that integration of work and life is, and the value of health. I don't know what you think, Vidusha.
No, absolutely. The only reason why I was laughing is that just make sure that you record that clip and show my wife. Because I don't smoke 15 cigarettes a day anymore.
Good. Congratulations.
You have reduced it.
It's been reducing. But seriously, that's the only good news I heard so far. I still have hope. But no, in all seriousness, right? I think, again, probably most of us in our part of the world, especially in Sri Lanka, in the subcontinent, we do 3 things. One is we hide things. We don't acknowledge it, right? B, we don't talk about it, because talking about it is a sign of weakness. Your son comes and asks you, I still go and ask my mom, how much did you make when you were working? And she says, none of your business. When is it going to be my business?
Never.
Never, absolutely, right? And third is we don't act on it, because we think if we act out, that is also a sign of weakness. That's what we were molded into, right? So you keep silent, you don't acknowledge, you don't talk about it, so loneliness thereof. And because you don't act it out when you first feel it, you bottle it up, and you bottle it up, and at some point you need to explode. So our generation tackled it that way. Now, there is a flip side with the younger generation, 18, 19, 20, 21, up to 25-year-olds. You will find that their threshold for pain is much less. And I think the reason for that is our fault as parents. Because notice the fact that most of our kids would have never gone through any of the hardships that you and I have gone through growing up. And we think we are sparing them of that pain. We are not. We are actually making them absolutely incapable of facing life. And if you notice the fact that what you're talking of and the resilience aspect of it, I do think that there is a generational gap in that. And we I think, suffer from it too. It's just that I think we found defense mechanisms which work for us, so we get on with it. But if you haven't taught your kids how to deal with it a slightly better way than we have, given that their life is out on social media, and again, we are to be blamed as parents for putting their life on social media from the time they're born. It wasn't their choice to be on social media, we put them on social media, right? So you have a kid who's growing up, who's comparing himself or herself to every single person that you see without being given a skill set to manage that and the emotions thereof, because parents probably are a little too busy doing a lot of other things. Whereas our parents would have kept us at home, there was no comparison apart from the guy next door to you and the guy who was sitting next to you in class, which is probably somewhat like you most of the time. You never met the Einsteins. If you went to a school like mine, you probably never did. But no, I'm dead serious, right? I mean, you have the most studious guys in front and you have your little clique, and you're only as good as bad as your little clique. That's all there was the comparison of. You didn't compare yourself with the rest of the world. You imagine yourself being compared to absolutely everyone out there on your feed and not being able to do anything about it, especially if you're a kid.
Well, they're also living in a world of fakes.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, let's be honest, 90% of what you see online is fake, but there is no way to know which is the fake and which is the real. So it's hard for them to know what are they comparing themselves to? Is it real or not?
No, absolutely. And when they come to work, what do you think is going to happen? So I think the fault, if there is one, is ours as the generation that brought them up. And I think we need to learn from that. Specifically as parents, I think 3 things needs to be taught. I think the kids, at least now, needs to be taught A, being able to take failure and be able to deal with it. Number 2, I think you need to be taught how to deal with the unfair comparisons that takes place and take a chill pill and not worry too much about it. And 3, I think you need to be able to focus over a period of time as well. Because our attention spans are reducing to such an extent, and most people assume that it's a skill that we already have. We don't. You need to be able to focus. So if you decide on focus and discipline as one thing, being resilient and being able to manage your emotions slightly better, I think we're equipping kids with the kind of skill sets that they require for work, for life, and that holds them well.
So that's why, Vidush, I always believe emotional intelligence is one of the core things I think every human being need to really understand. And I always say, when I go to the workshops, right, it's a default chip. We were born with it. Unfortunately, we're not tapped into it. So the whole objective of this particular whole podcast was really bring that limelight into how important, right, SEL, social emotional learning, we don't see in Sri Lankan schools, maybe. On some part, they're just practicing this. SEL is an important component in an education element. Then it comes to corporate context. The people are fixed, enable that chip when they come to the corporate context. So we have a little bit of mismatch in the system process. Let's not go there. And coming back to the leadership context, Imi and Vidusha, what would be a couple of or 1 or 2 challenges leaders face, and what would be your suggestions to overcome those challenges with a managing multi-generation workforce?
Shall I go? You want to go?
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm not sure if it's a challenge, but I think it's probably an opportunity, and I touched on it earlier, which is the greatest way to understand them is to listen to them. And I totally agree with you around social emotional learning. The reality is when you have children, when they're very little, like the little ones here, right? You say to them, listen to mummy, listen to auntie, listen to teacher all the time, right? So we constantly remind them to listen. And then they grow and we stop and we don't teach it in high school and we don't teach it in university and we certainly are not teaching it in the workplace. And listening, whilst it is innate, which is listening is the backbone to empathy. It's built into your prefrontal cortex at the front of your brain. You all have it. Probably the question I get asked most is, but Mimi, don't you just have more empathy than everyone else? And the answer is no, you all have the same empathy. But as you were saying, these are skill sets that we choose to use. And like anything that's a skill in life, if you don't use it very often, you get out of practice. So I think as leaders, the number one thing you can do to fill these gaps, to bring your workforce and generations closer together, is to ask them questions and listen to the answers. And the key here is to listen to understand and not listen to reply. Because often we're so busy waiting for our gap in that meeting to say, well, you know, this is my opinion and I want to share and I want to tell you and all of these things, that you're hearing, but you're not listening. And as you opened at the beginning, we have so many kind of preconceptions about what these youth are or aren't, or, you know, and we're talking a lot about the younger generation, but we also have to understand how to manage the older generation. Because we have more and more people, and so we should, staying in the workplace into their 50s, 60s, and 70s. And LinkedIn, as you mentioned it earlier, is alive with older people saying, why does nobody want to hire me? The irony is, I spent 25 years honing my craft to be the best I can be, and now they want to hire the young ones that don't have any skills. So what was I training for 25 years? So I think this empathy, this understanding of these generational gaps, yes, it's about the young people, but it's also about the older people. How do they want to retire? That dream, I know my father had it, which is that, I want to get a house and play golf and, I don't know, do whatever retirees do. Now I say to my audiences, literally, what do you want to do? Are you going to watch Netflix for 8 hours a day for the next 25 years, right? What are you going to do? And most people are not retiring to do that anymore. They might have a side hustle or a startup, or they open a coffee shop, or they help their son and daughter with their tech startup, right? But very few people that were in the professional world just retire and do nothing. It's that age has gone. So to understand these generations, my fundamental, I guess, piece of advice is to hone your listening skills. Ask people questions, be curious, and then listen to their answers and do not judge them. Just because they see it like you don't, doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's different. And the better we are at that, I think, Azim, the better we are at that, the more we can close those gaps.
Vidisha, before that, maybe. What if a leader says, sorry, I don't have time?
Ooh, they never have time, that's the problem. So empathy has two great enemies. One is high stress, and the other is low time. In the audience, who's got low time and high stress in your life? Put your hand up. Anyone with low stress and high stress and low time? I'm sure there's even more. Some of you don't. I know nearly all of you have low time and high stress. It is perpetual, right? None of us have enough time. We're all busy and we're all stressed a lot of the time. And empathy is hard to foster in that environment. But what I say to leaders when they tell me that exact thing, which is I don't have enough time to listen to everyone, Mimi. Two things. Number one, 1 minute, 60 seconds. That's all I'm talking about. If you're the CEO, find 60 seconds, even if it's once a day, with one person, and you will see a difference. But listen to them in that 60 seconds, look them in the eye, listen to them, they'll smile, see, even just by looking here. Listen to them for 1 minute, and you will fundamentally see your organization shift, okay? Everyone has 60 seconds. The second thing is that the better you listen, and the more you train your team to speak, the faster you get at listening and they get at speaking. So in the very beginning, I have two teams, but in one of them, in the very beginning, especially with my younger generational staff, they like to talk, right? So they can talk, like, for a really long time, right? And eventually I have to be like, okay, guys, like, I have some other things to do. But now, both me as a listener and them as a speaker, we have a very good equation for getting through that information so that they feel heard. They know that when they come to talk to me, I'm listening to them. But it doesn't take me, an hour to get that information. It'll take 5 minutes. So the first is never to underestimate the time you need. It can be very small to make massive impact. And the second is the better you practice at listening and train your team at speaking, the less time you need for the same amount of impact. So it is totally doable.
Thank you.
I just want to kind of add 2 bits to that whole listening piece. Everyone assumes you listen. What you do is hear. There is a difference between hearing and listening. That's the first mistake we make. We assume that just because we hear, we're listening. We're not. And I think the older we get and the senior we get in a career ladder, the less you listen because you assume you know. So in order for you to listen, the first thing you need to let go of is the assumption that you know. Forget that you know. You might not. And it's a scary place to be, to say you don't know. Right? You imagine your son or daughter who in their little and comes and says, oh, what about this? You have an instinct to say something rather profound, right? And to be seen as the great sage. And that's wired into us. Because every time you become a manager or a senior manager, people look up to you, especially in our types of cultures. We are hardwired and we are taught to say, you must know. And you are expected to know. What we are not told is that you're not expected to know everything. And most of us, almost all of us, would probably know less than we don't know, right? And the moment you know that inside your head, you're fine. So you listen only if you know that you don't know. The moment you say, I know, that's it, you've shut down. So that's number one. The second thing is, we tell other people to listen, right? Like you said, I'm just picking up from where you left off, which is to say, you tell your kids all the time, now listen. When have you listened to your kids? What is the process for that? And if they come and tell you, quick story, right? So I do this thing called the hot seat at workshops, where you're supposed to tell something, 3 positives and 3 negatives to the person in front of you, just like that. Okay? And of course, there's a set of training that needs to happen for that, otherwise you take it personally. So I institutionalized it at home. And the first time that was done, my 5-year-old son turned around and told my wife that her cooking is bad. And that was the end of the end of the hot seat, as well as, you know, I was in the dog pound for the next week. But I did tell her, you always tell him that you're cooking for him. And if you're not getting feedback from him about your cooking, who are you cooking for? Right? And that didn't go down well either. But so number one, you need to kind of get out of your predisposition that you know. And secondly, if you're asking someone else to listen, and this cuts both ways, you need to be able to listen too. So that goes for your juniors. And one of the things, the flip side, since you spoke about the seniors, let me talk about the flip side. Juniors need to be taught how to listen too. Right? We are always telling that leaders need to know to do this, and we talk about great leadership. Great leadership means nothing without great followers. And far too many times, forget juniors, we are too scared to go to our boards and turn around and tell our CEO that it was total crap that you were talking about. We think it though, right? And I always give the example of the emperor and the new clothes. How many times have your CEO or the managing director walked naked on the streets in corporate life because you didn't want to open your mouth and say something about it? And you expect your juniors to kind of really grow up and be empowered? That's not going to happen. You know, so we mimic behavior. Don't ever forget that from the time we are children, we mimic behavior. We don't listen to our seniors. We don't listen to our parents either. We mimic their behavior. That's how we learn. We learn our language like that. Take a Sri Lankan kid and put them in Japan, they'll speak Japanese. Without any problems whatsoever. Nobody taught them to speak Japanese. So leadership, if you really want the challenge of leadership, especially to kind of let go of all of this, listening is indeed the foundational piece that you need to carry up, and certainly emotional intelligence, but it needs to cut across the entire organization. The problem is that we teach leadership in isolation to a certain group of people. We don't tell other people how to support. So there is no leadership without followership. There's no followership without leadership. They're one and the same. The problem is we never talk about both sides of the equation. As much as you listen, the guy who's telling something needs to be able to speak well too. You know, and explain something in a way that you understand. Both needs to happen, right? But if you don't understand, you must be able to question. In order for you to question, the culture must allow that. How would you question otherwise? It's a bit like me and my father trying to decide, you know, where to go for the April holidays. My father always comes and asks us, you know, where shall we go? Whatever you tell him, it's not going to work. He will say, find some fault with it. And it ends up going to, you know, Norelia every April. So after about 3 years, you learn not to say anything. Where do you want to go, Norelia? Ah, yes, that's a good choice. Let's go there. You know, you need to create that environment too. It ain't going to happen by chance. So I think the biggest challenge that we have going forward in the leadership space is that we understand leadership in its entirety rather than piecemeal, right? It is a process, it is a collective effort, and as much as we charge the seniors of being good leaders, we need to charge our juniors being good followers too. And saying, if you don't change and you don't have the status quo changed, I don't think anything much is going to change.
All right, so it's time to go to the audience, right? You have two individuals on the stage, so you can shoot your questions, clarifications, anything if you would like to ask either of them. Anyone?
My name is Mohammed Afdal. Actually, you trainers, coaches talk about leadership, talk about corporate culture and all that, but nothing happens in the corporate world. The employees have been stagnated, they have been thrashed by the leaders. What are you going to do? What do you think we should do in order to get the leaders, so-called leaders? I mean, we say leaders, but they are actually managers or bosses around the actual world. How do you think we can change this?
I thank you for the question. I think we have to keep doing our jobs, right? Someone asked me a very similar question, actually. Someone in the UN asked me this yesterday. They said, Mimi, how, in your opinion, how are we going to change this? And I think it's a long journey. It's not going to happen overnight. And I really like what you did, where you sort of corrected yourself and said, actually, maybe these aren't leaders at all. They're just senior managers, right? Or bosses. Because I believe that we have a leadership crisis. And that's part of the problem. There just aren't enough leaders out there. And that's because the people at the top of the organizations today didn't take the time to create succession management because they were too busy climbing the tree at the time, right? And most of the leaders, in their defense today, or bosses as you've called them, they came up through the 80s and 90s, and in most of the world, and I know we're in Sri Lanka today, and Sri Lanka had a very difficult time during those years, but in most of the world, in those years, we were in boom economies, right? So whether you were living in those economies or you were learning from them, so perhaps you worked in an international institution and you were, following New York or London or wherever, they were in boom economies. And what that meant was that they never taught any of these emotional intelligence or engagement techniques because everybody was flying and they didn't care. Nobody needed these skills, right? You went to work, you touched on it earlier, Vidusha, you went to work, you did your job, you went home and you carried on for 30 years. And that has shifted. So we have to take the time now to train that next generation. And if I had to put my money somewhere, I would put it into middle management, particularly in Sri Lanka, because I think we have a real issue here where the people at the top have money and Mercedes and houses and they're doing fine, right? The people at the very bottom, so perhaps if you're in the apparel industry or anywhere with sort of a large workforce, they have bodies supporting them, right? So the people at the bottom also have it okay most of the time because there are people supporting them and lobbying for their rights. But the people in the middle, and this is one of the reasons they're all leaving, there is a missing middle, right? They are not, no one's looking after them. Right? So they don't have these lobbyists or groups to protect them, and the top isn't coming down to their level. So one of the main reasons we're losing all of our talent, amongst others, is that they just can't make any money in Sri Lanka at the moment, right? So they can go away to New Zealand, and in 2 years, they can pay off that house and manage the school fees and all of those things. So often, I work with Sri Lankans outside of Sri Lanka that they want to be at home. They want to be here. They just don't feel that they can. So I think that the major shift for us today is to look at the future and to look at the middle of our organizations and train them to do what the top, the bosses at the moment, aren't doing. That's what I would say.
Absolutely, and I think you must be able to afford to live, right, to begin with. So that's a starting point. But I'll give you 4 factors, right? The baseline for your question and the baseline to the reason why this question is coming up in the first place is that we do not have an ecosystem to build leaders. We have an ecosystem to build managers. That's it. So your entire policy framework, that's the starting point. That you start with your policies. You cannot do leadership training, coaching, whatever you want to do, and have archaic policies and expect people to change. You won't. It will not happen that way, right? I always give the example of the highway and Sri Lankan roads are, by the way, statistically, it's more dangerous to drive on a Sri Lankan road than to be in the front line of the army during no, statistically it's true. It really is. During the Civil War, the highest body count that we had right? If you take that and average it out for a year, and we take the number of people who die on Sri Lankan streets because of road accidents and average that by the year, it's actually more dangerous to drive on a Sri Lankan road than to have been there in the army fighting the LTT. If that doesn't tell you something, nothing will, right? So it's dangerous to be out here. So, but the people who drive like, Mad Max on the road, you go onto the highway and all of a sudden we are as good as Europeans. We put the signal this way, we put the signal that way, we slow it down and all the rest of it. Why? Because the infrastructure supports it. We don't have the cows and the dogs and the children and everybody else and parking somewhere in stupid lanes and all the rest of it happening on the highway. Yeah, if you did, you'll get fined. So, number one, build the policy framework, because that's the creator of your ecosystem. How you promote, how you reward people should be not only on performance. Notice the fact that the 80s and 90s, we just promoted people who performed well and assumed that they have great leadership skills. It doesn't work that way, right? So first, change your policy system, number one. Number two, have a rolling 3-year plan for a young person who comes in all the way up to being a CEO. And it needs to be in percolated buckets. Okay? So in your first couple of years, it must be about knowing the trade, knowing the industry, and about understanding technical skills. The second tier is what Mimi was kind of referring to as your missing middle, because they know their technical skills, but they don't have the emotional intelligence skills, leadership skills, and the other skills that are required for you to lead. And you feel desperately alone because you're trying to do your job the same way you did before you got promoted. And it doesn't work, right? So that's the second piece, right? So you need to coach people and groom people according to buckets in a rolling 3-year plan. Now, if you're taking a leader, you need to have performed for 3 years at least. And your team should be saying that, hey, you know what, we want to work under them. So what is the best way in my mind to ask that question? Ask the people on a blind voting system, if this guy was your boss, how would you feel? They'll tell you. But nobody wants to ask that question, right? Because our system doesn't support it. That's the second piece. The third piece is, once you've come to the middle, you need to understand that there will be 3 groups of people. One group of people have the potential and the capacity to go to the top. Some people don't have it yet, but might get there, might not. There's a 50-50 chance. And there's a group of people you know for a fact, like me playing basketball, this will not happen. Right? Just because you practice doesn't mean you get good at it. It's a lie that we tell people. Try again and you'll get better. You know, everyone has potential. Yeah, everyone has potential for different things. I can't be Michael Jackson even if I tried. I did, which is why I'm saying, I can't sing to save my life. I can't dance to save my life either. It's not just me. There are certain skill sets that God bestows upon you, and you got to make the best out of it. Now, will you get better than what you were yesterday when you're going through this rigorous process of development? Of course you will. But is that enough for you to lead organizations that has 10,000 people? Of course not. Don't kid yourself. Now the issue is, and you ask this question, what are HR managers supposed to do when they recruit young people? The first thing is, be honest to them. We lie through our teeth during recruitment because we want to attract people. And then they come inside the organization and wonder, oh my God, what have I got myself into? A bit like marriage, right? No, seriously. And the reason for that is because we paint a fantasy about marriage rather than the reality about marriage. It's wonderful when it's dating, and we assume that all of marriage is going to be like a dating period. No one tells you that there's a responsibility aspect to this. There's a sacrifice aspect to this. There's a lot more that go into it than flowers and roses and chocolates, no? Similarly, at work, most people assume, hey, I'm going to get the car, I'm going to get the title, I'm going to get a brand new desk and the corner office and all the rest of it. That's the management side of things. But what about the responsibility you carry? What about the workload you have to carry? What about the sacrifices you have to make on behalf of your team? That never gets discussed. So the 3 buckets, right? Filter them. And the final piece is, once you have got the guy to be at that level, a seasoned leader, once again referring to what you said, what about the older generation? You don't have to retire at 55. Make use of them to groom the next generation of leaders. Because the best people to teach leadership is not us. The best people to teach leadership are the leaders that you have inside your organization that people respect. Unfortunately, they are never designed mentoring programs where you actually follow footsteps of a venerated leader. That's about the best you can do. Supplement that at the middle levels with solid training and development and coaching and all of that. But at the top, take the best leaders that you have and get them to mentor the next second tier, third tier. Supplement that and put that into a framework, your problem will not exist. But start with your policies first. You don't fix that, nothing else that we do will ever make sense.
Vidusha, now I know why Roons didn't come today. Now I know why Roons didn't come today.
Yeah, I know.
Even his wife also. Yeah. Now I know why he didn't bring it. Right.
So
I think I can vouch for what Vidush said. That's what the framework we also been working. There are a lot of organizations that have been following it and really working for us in terms of, and we have been receiving a lot of feedback and how it's happening. I think the ecosystem need to be developed. That's the whole idea I think Mimi and Vidusha is saying. Any more questions? Yes, Samina?
This is going to be a quick one. In your opinion, what would you think is the most important outcome in an organization? Is it employee retention? Is it engagement? Is it productivity or efficiency? If you were to rank it, what would it be? That's one. I also read a study by Gallup, which said that engagement globally is 33%, and most of them are loud quitting. Most are quiet quitting. Is it true that 33% globally, as well as from an Asian context, is it just 33% engaged? And what does that mean? I mean, because we see so many people in South Asia that are actually really productive. And again, on a scale or from a percentage point of view, how important is empathy and EI on these 4 parameters that I talked of?
Now you're going to challenge me to remember them all on a Saturday night.
It could be anything. I may have been wrong in the outcomes. Productivity, it may
question.
Not even be that.
Listen. I think if you have to really simplify it to be fast, in case other people have other questions as well. I think even though I am an empathy specialist, so even though I spend every single minute of the day trying to create more empathy in the world, the fundamental KPI, the fundamental outcome of any business has to be performance, right? Because if there is no performance, there are no people, and if there's no people, you can not create any empathy or emotional intelligence or anything else. So my opinion is that as an organization, assuming we are in the profit-making sector, if you had to choose one indicator, it would have to be around positive growth and revenue, because otherwise you have no organization, right? If you had to choose one. But the other things you spoke around, engagement, empathy, emotional intelligence, they will lead to that indicator. So in absence of those, you will never reach the potential of that indicator. So that would be what I'd say in answer to that. And in your second couple of questions there around engagement, yes, those are global figures. You're absolutely right. Gallup's figures will show, I think, about 73% disengaged workforce around the world. I think what differs is culture. So you were talking about, kind of Asia versus the West. It's a challenge because most of that data comes out of the West. I've been in Asia for 20 years. It is hard for us to find data that is relevant here. But I think when you layer on culture, that's why you see a change. Because in many of those Asian countries that are driving that very high productivity, they are not where we are talking about today. They are still in that kind of autocratic, systemized thinking where performance is driven by sort of that master and follower model, and they're in that space because of the culture in those countries and the period of development that they're in. So I'm not sure that goes into great detail, but I think that's where we are. There is a gap in the data. You are seeing differences, and of course when we look at Sri Lanka, there's a whole different thing at play. But if you had to have that one indicator, it has to be around growth in some way. Would you agree?
Without a doubt, and I think that's the biggest mistake we make, right? We talk about things like empathy and emotional intelligence in isolation. The question is not empathy for empathy's sake. The question is empathy for growth's sake, right? The ultimate objective is profitability. And I get always told off, and I'm glad that at least once there is someone who agrees, because most of the times when I'm in a forum of this nature, I always get told off saying, you're a gory capitalist. I'm not. I'm just being realistic. If the company doesn't make the profits that is required for their shareholders, there's not going to be a business. Simple. Sri Lanka's interest rates are about 10-12%. You're better off putting that money in the bank and taking interest. So your margin has to be at least 15%. Otherwise, why run a business in the first place? Now, what you're looking at is this. What are the critical success factors that drives that profitability? Now, for that, multitude of things happen, right? But answering your question very, very quickly on this, understand the difference between, just don't look far. Understand the difference between India and Sri Lanka. Right? Here we are begging people to stay. There they don't. Because for every person who leaves, you have 100 people who are willing to take that job. The dynamics are different. Completely. You think empathy matters there? As much as it matters here? Of course not. So you have to, does it matter? Of course. If you take it as a concept, of course it does. It makes the world a better place. But it isn't going to fly there because nobody's going to bother because of the dynamics that gets played out. So you have to understand that whatever we are doing, we have to look at three factors. One is context. One is purpose. And one is whether you have the capacity to do that all as an organization. Sometimes lots of things are wonderful to do, but you just don't have the capacity to do it. Right? So 33% engaged, great, yes. The issue is not so much 33% engaged. The issue is, what would the 70 plus people who are disengaged do? Now, what they do in India is different. They will somehow stick around. In Sri Lanka, they won't. Because you have lots of other opportunities. In the West, they won't. They will leave. But the moment that context, the macroeconomic and environmental context changes, the need for it diminishes. Now, it takes a certain level of enlightenment leadership at that point to turn around and say, even if the context is that, we will make sure that we take care of our people. And what the data shows very significantly and very clearly is those who do that truly. By the way, lots of organizations talk about empathy, very few organizations practice it. So it is for all of us. Okay? Don't ever forget the fact that we are as much to be blamed on this as much as anything else. Ask how many people are truly empathetic as individuals, how many people will really help you. Ask for a favor and see whether it takes place or not. It doesn't happen. So if you truly are that as an organization, what the numbers show without a doubt is those organizations leapfrog when others just stagnate.
Sustainably, consistently.
Absolutely, right? And the second piece that I just want to add to you, because you are asking a question from a philosophic perspective as well, right? What you need to understand is that emotional intelligence and empathy are not nice things. We assume that this is all about the fuzzy-duddy stuff, right? The nice things. No, no, no. It's about telling people, you can't do this, you're not good enough to do this. Maybe you try something else. It's about being able to have a conversation with people who don't live values to say, if you haven't lived the values right inside the organization, I will have to remove you from your leadership position. And it is about answering your question again, having policy frameworks to remove leaders who do not live values as much as promote people who actually live by them. That's tough stuff. But it still is emotional intelligence and empathy, but we never talk about that stuff because we only want to talk about the nice stuff. So answering your question, it's very important for you to understand that if you choose to walk down this path, you need to do that sincerely, not for namesake. Otherwise, you're better off actually being authentically, nasty as an organization, because at least you know what to expect. The worst that can happen is to propagate yourself as an empathetic people plus, organization, and then walk into it and find that it is not. That's, I think, what is cataclysmic for all of us.
I think just to add on to Vidusha, right? Emotional intelligence, like as Vidusha, everybody talks about it now in Sri Lankan context also. Like people call, people ask for it, but the question Mimi and Vidusha is like, do they really live and abide about that in the organization? Is the value system developed? Even the tough conversations, right? How do you have those tough conversations? Look, you're not having it. How do you have those conversations with the AI component is something we need to develop in organization to really understand. That's where this piece is really important. Right. It's time to check out from the cafe.
Thank you.
Mimi, Vidusha, thank you very much for your presence here. I know we have been talking a lot and your timing was perfect, Vidusha. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to have. I think our audience got plenty of takeaways. one last message from your end you want to give out?
I'll give a
Oh, mine would be about empathy, because of course that's my specialism when we spoke about it today, and being authentic in that. The reality is there's never been a time when our world needs more empathy than now, and our society and civility relies on it. So we're talking about leadership in business today on the whole, but as humans, you guys have the ability to change the world, and listening is one step in the right direction. So please listen, and it will change the world we're living in.
Thank you.
Could I just, 3 simple things, because it's been a pretty heavy day, right? First of all, don't take yourself too seriously. Yeah? Empathy is not possible if you take yourself seriously, right? Take whatever you're doing seriously, but don't take yourself too seriously. The moment you do that, you can listen better, you can empathize better, and you can probably commit better. The second thing is, I think if you want to take leadership to the next level and build on the whole emotional intelligence piece, is you do need to self-reflect. I think one of the biggest missing links of skills is we don't introspect. We are very good at finding fault with everybody else apart from ourselves. So at least once a week, get self-critical and ask yourself the question, what have I done wrong that I can improve from? What can I learn from others that I have seen, right? So self-reflect. The third thing is, and he mentions this all the time, have a little bit of fun too. Life is a little too short to have all seriousness and then die. So have a laugh. If you make a mistake, laugh at yourself. If somebody else makes a mistake, laugh with him on the mistake. Not laugh at him. There's a difference between laughing at the situation and laughing at a person. Humor and fun, I think, makes everything bearable.